The blood-red liquid looked lovely in the translucent drinkware. "This wine is quite acidic," said the emperor, who already had a glass beside him. "It's how I prefer my wine," Jinchi replied. "I'm not saying I don't like it, but I'm told sweeter wines have been all the rage lately." At the word sweeter wines, an image of Maomao scowling drifted through Jinchi's mind. "Something the matter?" the emperor asked. "No, nothing." Jinchi realized he was in serious danger of smiling and quickly quashed the expression. The emperor gave him a curious look, but simply swirled his glass. The sudden passion for go can make us forget things. There are quite a few foreign goods making their way through the markets. Yes, sir. Jinchi was aware of that. A wide variety of imported products had arrived from the West along with the Shrine Maiden. It likely helped that taxes had been temporarily relaxed once more. "Do you know which of these is the most popular?" "I'm afraid I do not, sir." The emperor grinned. He could not always act so relaxed during his official duties, and he seemed to compensate for it whenever he was alone with Jinchi. Grape wine, Jinchi tilted his head. "Do you mean the wine from the western capital?" The area around Jayukai's hometown was a rich land for grapes. In fact, the wine they were drinking at that moment came from that region. The wine from the western capital has a unique astringency. "But this new stuff is sweeter. Quite good, I have heard. Is it really of such high quality?" Jinchi took a sip of his drink. The wine from the western capital was bitter, yes, but that was not a sign of low quality. He also knew the wine should have been sweeter. The wine he had in the western capital almost tasted like it had honey in it. Thinking about the wine brought something back to him, a memory. When had that been? Around the time Maomao had entered his personal service after leaving the rear palace, he swirled his drink. "Do you believe it's really foreign made?" he asked. "I haven't drunk it yet myself, but my advisors tell me it is divine. It might be best you do not try it." Jinchi glanced at Suken. When she came over to him, he whispered something to her. She was a very talented lady-in-waiting and understood what he wanted right away. She left the room and came back with a package. "What's this?" the emperor asked, stroking his beard. Jinchi showed him what was inside a metal cup. "I received it as a gift sometime last year." His thoughts took him back to the previous spring. "I think perhaps you'd better not drink the wine, sir," the taciturn young apothecary said as she cleaned up the servingware. Jinchi had just poured himself an after-dinner drink. "Why is that?" he asked. "I saw you check it for poison." He swirled the liquid in the cup. The apothecary had recently left the rear palace to return to the pleasure district. However, Jinchi had subsequently hired her on as his lady-in-waiting and food tester, sealing the deal with the offer of an excellent salary. "Yes, sir, I did. There was no poison in it as far as I could tell, but if you want my opinion, I think it is rather acidic." "That is perfect then." Jinchi in fact liked wines that were somewhat sour or acidic over those that were simply sweet. Suayan must have prepared a drink to suit his tastes. This wine had travelled all the way from the western capital. "The problem is with your cup, sir." "My cup?" He looked at the metal vessel he was holding. "Do you think it might be poisoned?" "No." The apothecary took the drink from his hand. "If you will pardon me." She dipped a chopstick in the wine and put a single drop in her mouth. She tasted it for a long moment, then she left the room. Jinchi assumed she went to spit out the wine and wash her mouth. She returned shortly with the bottle of wine. "Now it is poisonous," she said. "What do you mean, now it is?" "It is noticeably sweeter than it was when I sampled it," she replied. "If you let it sit a little longer, it would probably get even sweeter." "I do not know what you mean by that, but may I take a guess at what is going on?" "Please do," the apothecary said with a nod. Her expression remained impassive. She assumed the wine wasn't toxic on its own, but it became toxic when combined with something else. A slight smile came over the apothecary's face. It seemed he was right. Metal tends to dissolve when exposed to highly acidic things. "I suspect this cup is made of lead. When you mix lead into sour wine, it makes it sweeter, or so I have heard. They even say that in the West, lead is sometimes mixed into wine deliberately as a sweetener. People who drank it frequently got very sick." "I can only offer you my father's opinion, but he felt strongly that the lead was likely behind the cases of poisoning. He was the former medical officer of the rear palace and a gifted physician. He had even studied in the West at one point. Jinshi set down the lead cup without a word. I'm not certain you would develop acute poisoning symptoms by drinking from that cup once or twice, but if you used it consistently it could be dangerous. The apothecary was hedging her bets. She did not like to speak out of speculation. If the poison were to have an effect, what kind of symptoms would I see? Jinshi asked. The apothecary thought for a second. Do you remember the toxic whitening powder from the rear palace? Of course, how could I forget? I have heard that it contained a mixture of lead and vinegar. In other words, Jinshi would develop symptoms much like those who had been poisoned by the toxic powder. He nodded to show he understood. You should look into the drinking habits of the person who taught you to drink wine, she said. If that person used a lead cup, they probably gave the same cup to Jinshi, believing it was a kindness. Otherwise, there was the possibility of foul play. It wouldn't be the first time someone had attempted to end Jinshi's life. He would need to investigate the person who offered this cup and their intentions. May I add something else, sir? Yes. The apothecary looked at the wine remaining in the bottle. She said, you seem to think this wine is bitter on purpose because the land made it so. She gave the bottle a gentle shake, but I think it has begun to turn to vinegar because of the long journey to get here. He was quiet. She said the wine he had been enjoying was actually spoiled. I think if they considered transport methods more carefully, the wine could arrive here without changing its character so drastically. After all, the western capital was far away, and the journey was long and hot. Strange then that it tastes good to me, Jinshi said, puzzled. Maomao's expression hardened. Fatigue dulls the sense of taste, making you less sensitive to bitterness. Jinshi didn't say anything. Also, I prefer drier alcohols myself. It was not ideal to have your food taster make implicit demands. Unfortunately for her, Jinshi had always preferred sour flavors, or at least that is what he told himself. I think I'm going to stick to grape wine for a while, he said. Very good, young master, Su-in said obligingly, earning a scowl from the apothecary. Well, I hadn't heard that story before, the emperor said, draining his cup. Some baked treats Su-in had prepared sat beside him. So you are saying the wine that has been so popular recently is technically ruined or perhaps fake? This alcohol came from a foreign country. The journey would certainly be longer than that from the western capital. It would be hard to preserve the wine completely unchanged. Given that enough of it had been imported to flood the city markets, some of the bottles were almost certainly bad. The wine needed to be sweetened to sell well. This suggested that the wine currently popular in the city was poisonous, or someone might have been making wine locally and selling it as imported wine, which would be a case of fraud. Imports involved substantial taxes. Even with a light customs burden, there were still transport costs to consider and also scarcity value. Imported wine commanded much higher prices than wine made in the western capital. There was always a chance that a few decent untainted bottles had made it all this way, but it wasn't the most likely scenario. His Majesty said thoughtfully, swishing his drink and stroking his beard. The same poison as the face powder. Speaking of which, I understand that after banning the stuff in the rear palace, you also prohibited its sale in the marketplaces, yes? Yes, sir. It seemed the most appropriate course of action. What if the former ingredients of that powder became the sweeteners for this wine? Jinshi caught his breath, and his eyes went wide. How could he not have realized? It made so much sense. He said, I will launch a thorough investigation. He put down his cup and took a bite of one of the baked treats to calm himself. These treats were distinguished by their soft dough. Inside they contained dried fruit. They smelled faintly of alcohol. Each bite was comfortingly warm and sweet. Su-in must have known the emperor was coming. She had been his nursemaid as well as Jinshi's, and she likely wanted to give him some special treats to enjoy. The emperor said, clearly pleased, Su-in's baking is always wonderful, no matter how often I eat it. He was putting a treat into his mouth. Almost immediately he washed it down with his cup of wine, which had just been refilled. He brushed a hand through his beard to remove the crumbs. Then he picked up a black go stone with his other hand. I don't think we have played Go since before you entered the rear palace, he said, fondly returning the stone to its bowl. The former emperor passed away when Jinshi was 13 years old, and Jinshi became crown prince. In that same year he challenged the emperor to a game of Go. When he won, he earned the right to enter the rear palace as the eunuch Jinshi. All of this was so he could abandon his position as crown prince. Ever since then I have believed a man shouldn't bet on a game of Go, the emperor said. I'm afraid you cannot take it back now. I told you if you wish to be emperor I will happily give you the title when the time comes. He still hadn't fulfilled his end of the bargain with Jinshi. I do not wish it. He hadn't even wanted to be crown prince. But at the time His Majesty had no children. The former emperor's other offspring had perished long before. He had been forced to make his own new substitute. I have never regretted losing a game so much as I did that day, the emperor said. Oh, I doubt that is true. Empress Gyukayu had a son, the crown prince. She had also given His Majesty a daughter whom he doted on. Consort Lihua also had a son. What was the point of restoring Jinshi to the princehood now? Even if there was a reason to do so, it would certainly cause conflict. The autumn garden party was approaching, and it was expected that Gyukyuan would finally be introduced with his new name. If it hadn't been for trouble with the Sheahni's shrine maiden, the emperor would have done it already. He could not afford to anger his father-in-law any further. Jinshi also could not afford to upset the grandfather of the next emperor. He did not want to become the reason for a civil war, yet he needed to avoid the sparks that were already flying. Jinshi had a great deal to do but not enough ways to accomplish it. He needed more power. Perhaps I might make one request of your majesty. You aren't dreaming up another harebrained scheme, are you? I'm warning you, no more wagers. It's a small thing, he replied, taking the bowl of black stones. Or he was trying to. The emperor seemed to want to play black as well, and he wouldn't let it go. If I win, I would like you to lend me your go-tutor, the sage, for a little while. Giving Jinshi a questioning look, the emperor let go of the bowl. Chapter 10 Beitang. The aroma of medicine drifted through the room. Maomao looked at what she had made. She was pleased to have put it together right in her own chambers in just the few minutes since she had gotten back from work. Now she would finally be able to do some experiments. She thought this should do it. Her invention included 2 types of herbs. Some prevented poison from entering a wound and some revitalized the body. She mixed them together, added oil to keep them from drying out, and finally added beeswax to produce a balm. She nodded with satisfaction as she rolled up her left sleeve and readied her knife. She wiped the blade with alcohol to make sure it was clean, then flourished it. Someone cried out. Eek, it was Yao. Maomao, what are you doing? She said, I'm not sure I understand the question. She set down the knife. A fresh cut was visible on her left arm. She was testing a new medicine in her room. It was typical for Maomao, but it must have seemed strange to Yao. Don't worry, she said, I have medicine right here. She did not mention if the medicine would actually work. Developing new cures required trial and error. She admitted it would be nice to have someone else to test things on. She could practically see her father's frown. Occasionally she managed to use one of her concoctions on a sturdy-looking soldier. However, with a few precious exceptions, they did not return after she had helped them. A good violent training accident is what they need, she thought. It is true she was not always well liked. People became angry when she tried to keep mice. Once, she had the bright idea of shaving Maomao the cat to test a hair growth potion. The dismay from the other inhabitants of the verdigris house was so intense and loud that she had no choice but to give up on her plan. She certainly wasn't going to waste the shaven fur. She would have turned it into writing brushes. For all these reasons, Maomao's only option was to experiment on her own body. Now Yao was upset. You big dumb dummy, she said. What's the matter? NN asked, drawn by Yao's shouting. She was greeted by the sight of Yao holding Maomao's left arm and looking very unhappy. Yao exclaimed, say something to her, NN. About what? NN must have been making dinner because she was holding some bok choy. Perhaps some soup would be served to them. NN made a rich, delicious beitang soup by boiling fish and pork bones. Maomao resolved to help herself to some later. About this, just look at this arm. Yao gestured with Maomao's left arm. I see it. I suppose she is testing the effects of medicines. Is that true? Yao demanded. It is, confirmed Maomao. NN had sharp eyes. She probably guessed what Maomao was doing even though she had never actually seen it. If you knew about this, why didn't you stop her? Yao asked. I thought your arm never seemed to get better. It is because you have been giving it fresh injuries. Maomao had noticed Yao never commented on her bandage. It turned out it wasn't because she hadn't noticed it. She had been trying to be sensitive and not mention it. Mistress, this is something Maomao is doing purposefully. It is not simple self-harm. She is trying to develop effective pharmaceuticals. I did not think there was any reason to stop her. She is right. I have an objective in mind, Maomao said. Medicine and poison are two sides of the same coin. You have to balance your formula so that it becomes one thing and not the other. But the only way to know what you have is to try it. Any student of medicine ought to understand the importance of experimentation. The medical office even kept several kinds of domestic animals on hand for the purpose of testing medicines. This always caused Yao to look very conflicted, though in the end she never said anything about it. She knew it was necessary. Maomao thought this was similar, not something Yao really had any right to argue about, but Yao, scowling, wasn't about to back down. I don't care. That is no excuse to go on like this. She wouldn't let go of Maomao's arm. Friends don't let friends do this to themselves. Maomao and Enen both looked at her wide-eyed. Friends, right, Enen said. Friends, wouldn't I suppose? She looked at Maomao with a hint of jealousy. Right, friends, Maomao echoed. When she thought about it, she had been spending quite a bit of time with them outside of work recently. They shared meals, went out together, or just chatted. Those were things that could be classified as activities one did with friends. First Enen and then Maomao tried out the idea aloud. Yao's face got redder and redder. That was a slip of the tongue. She said, I meant colleagues, work colleagues. Anyone would stop their professional counterparts from doing awful medical experiments on themselves. Wouldn't they, Enen? Enen paused for a second to think. To be perfectly honest, she did not think it would help to try to stop Maomao. And anyway, if it was serving a higher purpose, maybe they should let her do what she wanted. Maomao nodded. All right. Well, I can do the same thing, Yao said. You most certainly cannot. Enen burst out, dropping her bok choy. I won't allow a single scratch on your beautiful, flawless skin, Lady Yao. It simply can't be allowed. I dare not even think of it. If you did injure yourself, I would make 10 times no, 100 times as many wounds on my own body. Could you live with that, milady? Enen had Yao by the shoulders and was shaking her. She looked very serious and was talking very fast, working herself into a frenzy. Maomao couldn't help thinking it didn't seem like a delicate way to handle one's mistress, but she figured Enen couldn't stop herself. The more you cared for someone, the more you wanted a say in how they behaved. This was especially true if that behavior involved hurting themselves. Yao had finally freed Maomao's arm, so she dabbed some medicine on it and rewrapped the bandage. Then she picked up the bok choy Enen had dropped. Say, do you smell something burning? She asked, sniffing the air. I left the stew pot on the fire, Enen said. There was a short pause and then all three of them raced to the kitchen. The pork buns Enen had been making were burned to a crisp. She had prepared a number that was a multiple of 3. This made Maomao think, or at least hope, that Enen had been including her. However, she could not work up any desire to eat the blackened food. I will clean up later, Enen said, sounding deflated. She did not seem as upset about the wasted food as she was about having to scrape up the charred bits. That will be a chore, Maomao thought. The congee and soup made for a simpler meal than usual, but Enen's beitang was exquisite. Maomao reaffirmed this to herself with every sip. She had asked for the recipe once, but Enen wouldn't tell her. She only looked at Yao and grinned. Maomao had decided it seemed wise not to press the subject. She did wonder what was in it, though. Unlike Yao, Maomao didn't mind lowbrow ingredients, so it didn't really matter to her what was involved. Yao looked somewhat disappointed by the dearth of side dishes, but she thoughtfully held her tongue when she saw how despondent Enen already was. As mistress-servant relationships went, this one was highly functional. In Maomao's view, this was because Yao was the object of Enen's intense, if not necessarily requited, affections. She picked up a scallop with her chopsticks and popped it into her mouth. The food still had a lot of flavor. By the way, Yao, did you want something with me? She asked. After all, the entire chain of events that led to the burned food had begun with Yao coming to Maomao's room. She was too timid to visit Maomao without a good reason, or at least a good excuse. Yao said, oh yes, I forgot. She set down her chopsticks and a piece of pork remained between them. She took a piece of paper from the folds of her robes. I have a schedule here. What kind of schedule? The physicians from the medical office often had to be on site during a festival or ritual occasion. Therefore, each month the office produced a schedule showing when doctors would be required for events. As Yao unfolded the paper, Maomao saw two very familiar words. It said a garden party. Indeed, this was the bane of all the consorts in the rear palace as winter was approaching. It looks like it's mainly that and the end-of-year observances, NN said, peeking over their shoulders. But isn't it a little late for a garden party? Maomao asked.